Well, hello, everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International, speaking to you this week from the Vendée in Western France. My co-host, Peter Lavelle, and I are delighted to welcome as our guest this week, Ewen Stewart of Walbrook Economics in the City of London, who is also a member of the Growth Commission and who last week in Paris presented a fascinating paper about Europe's low growth and what to do about it. And we're joined as well by Professor Richard Werner of Corvinus University in Budapest, Professor of Economics, who is a specialist, among other things, on banks and central banking. Many years ago, I was asked to speak at a very posh dinner in London by a very extremely grand European aristocrat. And he said to me, John, I want you to tell us everything that's wrong with the world and what to do about it in 5 minutes. So Ewen, I give you that challenge. I pass that challenge on to you.
Gosh,
because in the paper that you presented on Thursday, and Richard was present as well, you listed a lot of things which were wrong with the world, at least from an economic perspective. So go ahead, let's hear it.
Well, John, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was great to see you and you too, Richard, in Paris last week, where we did present what was wrong with the world, or at least part of the world, our part of the world, Europe. Yeah. And we produced I produced a paper looking at the decline of Europe, and the first picture we put on the board was of the fall of the Roman Empire, which of course happened in 476 AD. And it was a glorious, romantic picture of the barbarians at the gates. What I think did happen with Rome, though, was lots of incisions over 200 years, which broke the edifice of Rome until eventually there was nothing left. And what I presented in our paper in Paris was something very similar that's happening in Europe. Europe has made the world in the last 500 years. We may have passed the baton to our American cousins, but it's part of the same Judeo-Christian root. We have been a force for good, in my view, in science, in art, philosophy, religion, and culture. But for the first time in 500 years, there's a genuine challenge as to whether Europe is going to continue to be the philosophical, cultural, and economic powerhouse that it's been for the last 500 years. The book we put out, I'm sure, had lots of pretty charts, and I won't share them with you today. But perhaps the most striking one was that if we jog back to 1990, in 1990, the continent of Europe, or the European Union more specifically, accounted for roughly a quarter of global output on a purchasing power parity basis. Today, and it was the biggest region in the world, it was bigger in America, and China accounted for just 3% of global GDP on that measure. Today, Europe is no longer a quarter, it's a seventh. China has gone from 3% to 18%. It's the biggest single region in the world, and America is more significant. But more than that, within a dozen years, if current growth continues, the subcontinent of India will have a greater GDP than all Europe combined. If that doesn't make people smell the coffee, I'm not sure what will. Now, it's true to say that we still have a higher wealth per head, per capita, in Europe than India or China. But I would suggest that that degree of decline simply will mean that Europe is going to become increasingly irrelevant, but not just irrelevant, our relative standard of living is declining. And
I think you're right, Ewen, to emphasize the relative, because that's really incontrovertible, isn't it? Relative to the United States, relative to Asia. The direction of travel, as you say, in the last 30 years is absolutely unambiguous.
It is. And some people say, well, it's inevitable. We're a rich part of the world and others will catch up. Our paper shows that is a fallacy because other rich parts of the world are performing much better. The OECD over the last 25 years has grown by over 40%. Very similar amount for the United States. Actually, Australia and Canada have done better. And there are other examples. Singapore's done even better than that. Europe has grown by about 19%. It's about 1% per annum over that period, about half the rate of growth of the United States. And you might say, well, that's so what? So what? Actually, it matters a lot. That's cost the European economy 3 trillion in opportunity cost, 8,500 a head per annum. Huge sums of money. And actually, in actual fact, in 1990, the average American was about $5,000 better off than the average European. Today, it's more than $20,000. This is a huge structural decline.
Yeah, if you look at per capita GDP, I know these figures are to be treated with caution, but I'm sure you both you, Ewen, and you, Richard, know perfectly well that the Eurozone is, I think, on the level of the 48th or 49th poorest American state.
That's correct. I mean, we're about at the level of Mississippi. In fact, I think I was going to say we're 50th or something like that. You know, so there's been nothing.
Now, Peter, your microphone switched off.
Sorry, but do you gentlemen know what it's like in Mississippi?
I haven't had the pleasure. No, can you enlighten me?
Well, I do, and that I don't know. We're how many minutes into this? We're like 7 minutes into it. I'm not sure we need to go much further. I mean, if Europe is trending at Mississippi level, then maybe just turn out the lights. I mean, that's an extraordinary finding. Extraordinary.
Well, it's per capita GDP in absolute terms, and as you know, these figures are, you know, they need to be nuanced and corrected and so on.
Sure.
But again, I go back to what I said about relative. You know, we make comparisons.
But I want to ask both. I mean, is growth important to European elites?
Well,
is it? I mean, go ahead.
It's important to the population.
Oh yeah, I asked about the elites.
Yeah, I get
that power.
Well, I would say if the elites, they're acting like it's not important. That's for sure, because no doubt we can talk about why it's underperformed, and we will do that a little later. But if they believe it doesn't matter, I don't know what they're smoking, because, you know, without getting into debate about Ukraine, you can see how irrelevant Europe has become relative to the United States in that debate. The UK and Europe is going to become globally less significant. We're looking already at the United States pivoting eastwards. Economic power and influence are hugely connected. And yes, Europe might have a seat at the top table for a little bit longer than you might imagine. The President Trump's being entertained by the king as we speak, and no doubt it's quite a grand occasion. But the reality is, without the wealth to back that up, in the medium to long term, your influence will decline. Your soft cultural assets and your hard cultural assets will wither. So if European elites are not taking this seriously, they are writing their own death warrants. In fairness, I actually think in Britain, largely, although there is a counter debate now outside the two main political parties that is getting it, but in fairness to the European Commission, they did actually produce a very major report, several hundred pages long. Unfortunately, they got Mario Draghi to write the report, the ex-ECB chairman, and he wrote actually quite an interesting report. There's a lot of very good data in it. I would encourage you all to read it, which actually we concur with much of the evidence he provides for structural decline. The trouble is we profoundly disagree with his conclusions. His conclusions are more centralization, more Europe, more central planning, more net zero, you know, etc.,
and more debt.
Yeah, and these are all the things which are the opposite of what made Europe great initially. And what made Europe great?
In your report, you, if I remember correctly, you listed. Please correct me. I think I understood you to say that there should be obviously cuts in the size of the state, deregulation, things that, you know, sort of Thatcherite things that we kind of know about. But you also mentioned other, perhaps slightly less common factors like immigration. Could you quickly say what you think the causes are of this death spiral that Europe seems to be in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors. One is the way that the monetary union operates, and I think it's a suboptimal union. And secondly, there's been a public debt explosion. Debt to GDP of European countries has increased from about 60% to 100% over the last 25 years. There's some bright spots, but by and large, Europe has increased its debt levels very significantly. But the most important factor is that Europe is the statist controlled region of the world, bar none. You contrast the size of the state in Europe, which varies from country from about 44% at the more liberal ones to about 55% at the least liberal. You contrast that with America, 10 points less, Asia, 20 points less, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not just the size of the state. There's not another region on the planet that regulates in the way that Europe regulates. There's hardly an industry untouched, be that the financial services industry, be that the energy sector, be it the debate about net zero, the one region in the world that takes net zero seriously. Every other region actually has quite rightly looked after its people to provide cheap power. And so it goes on. So it's no surprise that Europe is failing. Now, that model might just have been credible, just being the management of decline when the Democrats were in power in America, because America tacitly wanted to export a high-cost model. But there's now been a breach with President Trump, a very, very clear breach. So there's not really another region in the world that is prepared to go along with Europe's high-cost model. So what Europe has got is on a collision course with disaster, with very high costs, deindustrialization, very high welfare model, and very low productivity. And that is a recipe for disaster.
So you mentioned Mario Draghi. He, of course, was whatever it is, president of the European Central Bank. And he is the architect of what we now know as quantitative easing. Well, it so happens that Richard Werner is the inventor of the phrase quantitative easing, I believe, Richard. But I guess that you don't approve, am I right, of the way that Europe tried to print its way into growth from 2008 onwards? Richard?
Well, that was never Draghi's intention. So the so-called quantitative easing employed by the ECB was of the same type as the so-called quantitative easing employed by the Bank of Japan, until finally Prime Minister Abe, who won a landslide victory 2012, in 2013 appointed a new governor to the central bank with the explicit remit to take some more drastic actions as recommended by some people such as myself. He'd written my book, read my book, Princes of the Yen, and he was aware we can create a recovery. And then finally the economy recovered. So what the ECB has been doing consistently was to create the very problems we're discussing. This has been a consistent policy design. And what we get is what was predictable. And that's true, of course, for also other areas apart from monetary policy, not just monetary policy. So the main, perhaps also briefly in response to Peter's question, is clearly the European elites do care, and they do want to destroy Europe and its economy, and they do want to industrialize. I do like to, and they're getting what they've been asking for. And I do like to quote one mainstream economist in this context, Paul Samuelson. He proposed a theory in his early days that he called the theory of revealed preference. And it says that, of course, he applied it to people, ordinary people who we call consumers in economics. And the idea was that, well, of course, as a psychologist, you can go around and interview people and you get what they say. But don't trust what they say, because this may be very different from what they actually do. You need to watch their actions, and because they have enough information, they are human beings, they are in charge of what they do. That means their actions reveal their true preference. Now, when we apply this to the ruling decision makers in Europe, there's no escaping, and Ewen, stated how enormous the state sector is, the state controlling everything, and particularly in the monetary sphere and financial sphere, we know it, and market participants know it. The extraordinary power of the central banks, and the ECB is the most powerful and most unaccountable, least accountable central bank in the world. So they've got all the powers. This is what they wanted. Their preferences have been revealed. And that is very important for people to realize, because we still have this narrative, even among critics, that, oh, well, they weren't as smart enough. They weren't as smart as me. I know what's going on, but they didn't. So that's really, we have to excuse them. It's just not smart enough. It's time to end that charade. We have to face the truth that the decision makers, the true decision makers, have been pushing Europe onto that cliff, and they want to push it completely off that cliff. It's about the destruction of Europe. Now, anyone who thinks, well, that's kind of hard to believe, well, it goes against the facts. If you don't want to believe this, this is what the facts are telling us. But we do have precedences, and that's, of course, the thing to do in such cases. You can look at history and other countries and other time periods. Now, the most recent such example is, of course, Japan itself, as I show in my book, Princes of the Yen. And, it was an astonishing story and realization. I wasn't aware in the beginning that this is what my research would yield. The disastrous combination of policies taken for more than 2 decades. And of course, well, if you include the entire recession, which is already 2 decades, we're talking about 3 or 4 decades of disastrous policies, were taken by rational actors, and as I could show, intentionally. And the result was also as desired. The key decision makers are the central banks, and here we have to say, the truth, of course, is there's many smart and good people within central banks, but the problem is usually that the top in the hierarchy, the decision makers, are quite different and have different goals. Even their own staff are not aware of where they steering the big super tanker. It's slow moving, and it takes a while to find out that the captain was not following the best course of action. So the Bank of Japan forced the Japanese banks to massively expand property lending in the 1980s to an unprecedented extent. This had to cause this massive asset bubble, which at the time people didn't recognize. The asset bubble is all they tried to explain with productivity gains and all sorts of nice theories, and standard economics is brilliant for that. The market tells us all this is great, so it's fine. But it was purely pumped up, an unsustainable asset bubble, a Ponzi scheme created by the Bank of Japan, as I show, through their window guidance, direct credit controls. The banks had no choice. They had to do what they were told by the regulators, namely massively increase property lending. Because bank lending is money creation, that boosts the money supply injected into the property market. Property prices had to surge to this extraordinary extent that, the Imperial Palace Garden, little public park in central Tokyo, had the same market value as the entire state of California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, you name it. And then once you're at this peak, that's when the central bank again acts and pulls the rug and tightens the quantity of credit. They love to talk about interest rates. That's their smokescreen. I've shown in my empirical work that interest rates follow economic growth and are positively correlated. So they're not the policy tool they tell us about. And but it's a nice diversion. That's their alibi. Look, we're trying to stimulate the economy now that we're in a recession. We're lowering rates. Well, if the quantity of credit stays tight, even zero interest rates won't work, is what I told them in 1994, 95, trying to be dramatic. We had 5% on the long, 10-year government bond yield on the JGB. And they decided to prove me right by driving it down to zero, and lowering short rates to zero had no impact because the quantity of credit stayed tight because the banking system was bust. And, as I show in my book, all these leading decision makers, Mr. Fukui, Mr. Mieno, they were the guys in the engine room at the time, controlling bank credit, the quantity and allocation of bank credit before they were given their higher jobs, and then, were rewarded for their good work as deputy governor and then governor of the central bank. And so I could trace it to these guys, and they've told us, they've said it in speeches. Recovery once we were in recession is not good. We need this pressure on the economy because we want to change the economic structure. Japan was very successful. It created a lot of wealth and prosperity for a lot of people, for the middle class, for ordinary people, for small firms, and that wasn't allowed to happen. That had to be changed. Because you go back to the 80s and they will tell you the same story, the same people as I trace in the book. They're already then saying, oh, we need to change. The system has to change. They quoted their goals of structural change. What does it mean, structural change, that they wanted? And it was the same as the US structural impediments initiative. America was asking Japan to implement these changes, but it wouldn't work on the political level. So the Americans used their willing satrap in Japan, which is the central bank, which did their bidding and engineered this destruction of the successful high growth economy. High growth is no longer allowed.
But Richard, are you saying that they are? Are you saying that they're operating? Yes, we're both. Peter and I want to know why. Did we understand you correctly to say that they were acting under the orders of the Americans? Is that what you're saying, or did they have some other national goal?
Certainly, it's clearly. Can be clearly established that certainly the Federal Reserve is the central bank that has the biggest influence on the Bank of Japan among central banks, and the Bank of Japan is part of that political mechanism that ultimately is controlled by the US. But that doesn't mean there's no other players. I do believe that the BIS and the meetings in Basel, which we see no protocols and minutes on, are important. And so the circle may actually well be wider among the central planners of these central banks, but clearly that's where we have to look. We have to look at the West, and that's why it's not surprising that what I feared might happen then actually did happen. I did warn about it in my book in the last but one chapter on the ECB, which was a young central bank. This came out in 2003. I did the analysis of its institutional setup. I concluded that the official propaganda that the ECB is the continuation of the successful Bundesbank is utterly untrue. And instead of doing what made the Bundesbank successful, they did the opposite in this design of the ECB. What made the Bundesbank successful was the following. You have to compare to its highly unsuccessful predecessor, the Reichsbank. And what made that Reichsbank so unsuccessful? It wasn't just the one thing that some observers look at, interest rate and policies and inflation rates. No, the key thing was that this central bank created boom-bust cycles, crises, and economic mayhem and disaster. Already as soon as it was founded in 1876, it started to create an asset bubble, classic, driving up stock prices, creating a stock market bubble in Berlin, the financial center of Germany in the 1870s. Then at the peak, pulled the rug, tightened, crash, collapse, bankruptcies, deflation even. The economy shrinks, deflation, unemployment. It's always the same game. They have no new games. You just need to look at history. And then the central bank, after the First World War, it was given more powers. It was already extremely independent and powerful, don't get me wrong, because it was 100% privately owned, just like the Bank of England at the time, and the Federal Reserve still is 100% privately owned. But it was considered by international decision makers that there was still the possibility that Germans may look after German interests, so that had to be changed. So they changed the law in 1922. The Reichsbank was made independent of the government, but also independent of any parliament or any law or lawmakers and democratic assembly in Germany. it could only had only to report to the reparations committee controlled by JP Morgan, which later was turned into the BIS. So that was the setup. And as soon as the ink dried on that new legal agreement that made the Reichsbank even more powerful and more independent, they switched on the printing presses. And of course, this hyperinflation destroyed thoroughly the middle class. People's money was gone, impoverishment and disaster. And then the same central bank created that setup that, again, they replayed this in the Asian crisis in 97, 98 with Thailand and Korea. They did the same thing on Germany before, so none of that is new. It's very easy to see and predict and warn about, as I did. And namely to create this time bomb, get the top Berlin banks, the 5 big banks, half of their, at the end in 1931, half of their short-term deposits were dollar denominated, while of course in the US the Fed had been created this asset bubble, usual story, pulled the rug, tightened, and then of course you just had to wait for this. I mean, they lit the fuse and you had to wait for the whole thing to go off when then the American investors who'd lent money to Germany would pull the money back. And of course, that's when the Reichsbank then insisted, yes, this money had to be paid back to the last penny. And the banks had to repay this. And they didn't have the money, so they had to foreclose on their customers, bankrupting essentially German industry overnight, creating 25% unemployment. And the guy who arranged all that, he'd stepped aside just before, he'd lit the fuse, stepped aside, and then contacted the Nazi party and told them, oh, by the way, bad times are coming up, as surely they did. And I've got a good economic program for you guys. I can get you into power. And this is exactly what happened. So this is the Reichsbank. This is the history of the Reichsbank. Disaster after disaster. I can't think of a worse central bank until the arrival of the ECB. And it's just been, step after step implementing the same disastrous policies. Now, so I warned in this chapter, in Princes of the Yen, that sadly, because its legal status was not a copy of the Bundesbank, but the opposite. The Bundesbank was made successful by making it not more independent, as most people think. No, making it less independent, making it accountable to German parliament, democratic assemblies. And lo and behold, it worked. It did really well. Well, it did too well. It made other central banks look really bad. It never created an asset bubble and banking crisis. And created fairly stable and high growth and low inflation, even in the 70s. So that's very bad. It had to be abolished. And so they abolished what then was the European currency, the Deutsche Mark, under the propaganda of proclaiming the introduction of the European currency, which was not true because the euro is a foreign currency for every single country. And the ECB was established on the model of the Reichsbank. So my chapter is entitled The Revival of the Reichsbank. And I predicted that this central bank, sadly, we have to assume based on this setup, is likely to go out and create bank credit-driven asset bubbles, banking crises, recessions, large-scale unemployment, economic disaster, and mayhem in the Eurozone. And almost as soon as I published the book, from the year 2004, the next year onwards, they started revving up bank credit in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece.
Yeah,
they popped the bubble in 2008, 2009 with the US, banking crisis starting there, and then the rest is history. I mean, Greece had more than a decade of recession and shrinking GDP growth, unbelievable. Youth unemployment in the 2010s. In Spain and Greece, not just double digits, youth unemployment is 50% at the peak, a whole generation deprived of their opportunities. And then you see the ECB has a different remit from the Bank of Japan. So you have to understand the scale of disaster we're talking about here. Because the Bank of Japan's job is merely to look after Japan, which it didn't. It was looking after foreign interests. Well, the ECB's job officially is to look after, I don't know how many countries it is nowadays. It's just every year there's another country joining, talking about more than 20 countries. So what do you do then if you have to do a Bank of Japan? If your job is to create disaster and mayhem, you know what you do? You do it in 2 phases. Phase 1, the periphery, So you create these bank credit driven property bubbles, asset bubbles, banking crisis and recessions, first in the periphery, because that way you can really shake up things. And they were hoping apparently that then a lot of people would also migrate from the periphery to the center, shaking up things. You know, it's the Mongolian strategy. It's pushing foreigners into a country before you attack, soften them up for defeat. Anyway, but it didn't happen. So they needed others to be pumped in, it seems, which happened, you know, around 2014, 15. Well, phase two started right with the crisis when they popped these bubbles in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. That's when they started with the property bubble in Germany, as they wanted at the time. And I did tell people, you know, if you want to make some money, German property, it's going to have a good run, more than a decade probably. The peak was in autumn 22. And the property bubble has burst, created by the ECB, which forced the German banks, excuse me, to massively expand bank credit creation for property lending. There's no good reason to do this. It was the most stable property market in Europe. But the central bank did it. I was even present in several supervisory meetings of the bank regulators, meeting the bank and essentially telling them, you know, there's no other way now that we've lowered interest rates to zero. How are you going to survive? What are you going to do? You know, we've got negative rates. We've increased regulatory burden. Your costs have gone up. How are you going to survive? Well, there was only one option left. Or we're going to do more property lending. We're going to create some subsidiaries that also invest in property. We're going to move into the property market. Oh, and then they were happy. Okay, fine. All right, we see that's your business.
I'd like to ask both of you. I'm not an economist, but most of the events that you've mentioned, I remember. We lived through them. Then what is the goal here? I mean, it sounds like intentional demolition, limited
That's what it
growth.
is.
And what growth? One of the questions I always have for economists, because I agree with John, you know, when people say GDP, well, it's kind of meaningless, okay? But if there's growth for whom? That's what interests me all of the time. And it seems to me, as a non-economist, is that the goal is something like just maintaining the status quo, whatever comes. I mean, because there doesn't seem to be any kind of imagination. I mean, both our guests here know economic history very well. I mean, maybe you would avoid this problem. We've seen it before. It doesn't seem to happen.
But Peter, you're still somehow assuming that the decision makers don't want this disaster to happen.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, it's the hardest thing to actually follow through and believe when your eyes tell you, when the facts tell you this is intentional, because it seems not to make sense. Well, I mean, that's so true with many things happening, that ordinary people, most people, I would actually say, most people are good and they have a natural sense of wanting to contribute positively to society. And I think that's the majority of people. That's us. We're the majority. But the problem is there's a small minority of people. I mean, you could say it's a disease. Maybe it's, you know, being pathologically having some kind of mental problem or whatever it is, but they do have bad plans. Now, this is very hard to believe for the majority, for us good people, because we're not like that. But if you just study history, that is the reality. You know, you've got essentially a bunch of psychopaths who aim at absolute power, who have been, their minds have been corrupted, and power corrupts. And particularly once you have a lot of money already, you just want power, you want control over people, you want to enjoy and exert that. And that's maximized when you create disasters and crises. And at the same time, of course, there is a profit motive as well still left, because if you're an insider, disasters are the best way to shake things up and shake people down. And you can collect because you know where to go to collect all the money dropping off. So, but the key thing I wanted to say also in relation to the earlier discussion is that Europe's problems have only just begun. This is the very modest beginning of the disaster we're going to see. Germany is going to be in a massive banking crisis in the next 2 years, probably. You can string these out. They did in Japan. They strung out the banking crisis for a whole decade, but there's a limit to that. And I think there's the timing, of course. The other goal, and this, Peter, is perhaps a response to you, a more concrete response to your question. Why? You know, why? because there are plans to transfer even more power from the state level to a centralized bureaucracy, to the central planners, namely totalitarian total power, unprecedented in history, through the introduction of central bank digital currencies. So really the agenda behind the scenes is one to centralize power and control. And really, if you look at the 20th century, it's been one that was characterized as the biggest trend in the 20th century was the ever larger trend of transferring power from the many to the few. And gee, has that accelerated in the 21st century? And that seems to be what it's about, because with a central bank digital currency, it's a dictator's a dream come true, programmable. You can micromanage society. You'll be using AI because you don't want to deal with the pleb, ordinary people, of course. And actually, it's probably bad news if they tell you, well, we've got personal treatment for you and your spending. But it's going to be, one way or another, it's going to be a totalitarian nightmare.
Well,
that's
you
what
mentioned,
but they need a crisis. They need a crisis to do that. And that's why we're heading for this even bigger crisis.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but you mentioned the
Ewen,
word pleb.
I can see
You
Ewen
mentioned the
would
word
like to.
pleb. Does that mean that this is a return to some kind of serfdom? I mean, this is what it sounds like to me.
Indeed,
we're going.
Serfdom is still a polite way of putting it.
It's high tech in reverse. We're going to use high tech to go reverse.
Of course.
I mean,
go ahead, Ewen.
Can I give you my take on this? There's aspects of Richard's comments I certainly agree with, and there's aspects I'm not so sure about. What certainly the actions that have been taken in the last 20 or 30 years have been about as conceivably bad as they could have been in every aspect, in terms of trying to provide prosperity and stability for the peoples of Europe. I think we can agree on that. Was it by design or poor choice or naivety? I mean, these are clever people. It's utterly naive to believe that we're dealing with people that are not smart and don't have a lot of access to information. I completely get that. There is, as you well know, great countries can go astray. Germany, clear example of that in the last century. Russia, 1917. There are lots of other examples of highly civilized countries that have the highest philosophy, art, and culture that go astray. So
good thing Britain never went astray.
Yeah, well, we may be going.
It'll come. Don't worry, it's coming.
I'm pretty concerned, to be honest. On your point on central bank digital currencies, it's a grievous threat to liberty. I completely agree with you. Unfortunately, when the atom bomb was invented, it's very difficult to uninvent it. The technology exists, and people in power will always be tempted. We are going to struggle to stop, whether we like it or not, central bank digital currencies coming into existence. But if they do come into existence, the most stringent controls on freedom and liberty must be adhered to. Can we do that? I have my doubts. But completely, Richard, with you on that. I'm with you on how money is created. It's created largely, central banks create some of it, but the majority is created by the commercial banking sector. I'm with you on the need for diversity of banks, and I'm with you of the fact that diversity of banks has been withering. I am struggling to understand, though, why an elite would want to crash their own zone, because ultimately, while of course you can make a lot of money shorting if you're clever, I think that would be a very cynical reason to do that. I think there have been different philosophical strands in society, and as you well know, there's been a strong egalitarian, Marxist, and various derivatives of that strands, which have, I would say, infected European and other countries' cultures. I think there has been a high degree of cultural capture of our institutions. I see that profoundly in the United Kingdom. But the people that believe in that extreme egalitarianism, if you want to call it that, believe it because they believe that to be a moral good. I'm not with them in that philosophy, but I think to say that they've deliberately crashed the economy is a stage too far for me.
But this you just said egalitarian, but the reality is the reverse. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
Inequality.
That's obvious.
Well, that's undoubtedly true, but it's sold. The left sell their ideology as an egalitarian ideology.
But that's a cover for giving more power to the state. That's the way I've always looked at it.
Exactly.
Well,
the whole left
right.
right is also a cover. The whole left right is also a cover. They want us to argue while the central planners, technocrats, are given more and more power, and their goals are not to create prosperity for the majority, but to further centralize control systems
and they get to choose winners. They get to choose winners, and by doing that, they create losers.
Mm-hmm. That's undoubtedly true. I think we all agree that extreme centralization is a disaster. It's a disaster in banking. It's a disaster in planning. Europe's greatness came from its diversity. Actually, at the simplistic level, the Italian city-states competing against each other. European countries competing.
Exactly.
Yes, we're all part of a Judeo-Christian civilization, but it was that competition that actually spurred European greatness. Look at the Holy Roman Empire, for example. Each of those principalities had their own courts, their own musical courts, their own scientists and alchemists and philosophers.
Exactly. Court alchemist, court factor, war factor, arranging the funding.
And that is, I think, a primary factor of Europe's success. Unfortunately, in the last 100 years, that has been reversed. Some of that has come from, dare I say, warfare. Before 1914, the left-wing historian A.J.P. Taylor, famously said a law-abiding Englishman's only occasion to meet with the state was to see the bobby on the beat or the local postman. The state was 10% of GDP, roughly, and most of that was on the Royal Navy. There was a tiny and there was a welfare state, but it was actually handed by the church largely and locally. Since the war, people have given enormous power to governments, and that has increased, and that trend has increased greatly in the last 30 years. In the British case, the state has moved from a third of the economy to almost half, but it's much worse than that because industries that were barely regulated a generation ago are now regulated into their lives. I look at the banking industry, the energy industry, net zero, employment law, the list goes on. A degree of regulation that previous generations wouldn't have thought was possible.
Outside the Soviet Union, that is.
So we are in a highly advanced road to serfdom. And this is one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, why Europe is sinking economically and other parts of the world are growing. However, there now is, I think, a proportion of the populations of Europe are waking up. Their anger at what's going on is, in many cases, poorly defined and it varies from person to person. But there's now an appreciation that all is not well and that the power of the state.
Maybe you could marry that thought with what happened over the weekend in London.
Yeah, I mean, it took me by surprise, to be honest.
Me too.
We don't know how many people are on the street, but I can tell you one thing: it wasn't 110,000. It was very significantly more than that. Yeah. And I wasn't there, but my understanding was there was only 25 arrests. That's 25 too many, but an extremely small number. And
against over 400 at the Notting Hill Carnival in August.
Yeah. I mean, eyewitness counts suggest it was a very well-mannered event. you know, you drive on the motorway or across the UK, as I have in the last week or two, there are a lot of flags out there. So what I think has happened is there's been a silent censorship where people haven't been able to say what they actually think.
Sorry to interrupt. What's the whole deal with the flag? A lot of people may not know what you're talking about. You saw a lot of flags.
Yeah, well, Union Jacks or St. George's flags are appearing up and down the country. And it is basically people saying, and it's a political gesture saying we're unhappy with the degree of migration, the degree of control, the lack of free speech in this country. I think the degree of anger about what's going on is extremely high. What is true is that not everyone agrees. I think almost everyone agrees that things are terribly wrong. There perhaps isn't complete agreement on solutions to rectify the problem. And it's made extremely difficult that our civil service, our judiciary, that most of the academic community and the media, or at least the mainstream media, all support what I would describe as an extreme leftist liberal apparatus. So
right,
actually,
and the clue is in the flag, St. George's flag. Well, what is St. George famous for? For slaying the dragon. Who's the dragon? Well, who has the dragon as their symbol in the United Kingdom? It's actually an institution that's not part of the United Kingdom. Namely, it's an extraterritorial enclave, the City of London Corporation, that the king is not allowed to enter without permission because it's not part of his sovereign area of his realm. And it's the dragon, right? Who else is the dragon? Well, what was this dragon square mile created for? Well, that's where the banks are. That's where the Bank of England was created. And who's the dragon in Europe? It is, well, Draghi means dragons, plural even. Why? Because his job was to run so many countries from one external central bank with a foreign currency. But actually, just on the point of Europe, and again, still trying to seek answers to Peter's questions and John's question, why, and what are these goals here? I think a good clue is this creation of these European institutions, because it's so new. I mean, with England, we do have to go a few centuries back, the creation of the Bank of England and the slow process of creating national debt and income taxes being introduced and centralization, bureaucracy being introduced and further strengthened. That's a big picture. But in Europe, it happened in just a few decades. So it's much easier to detect. All these European institutions, I mean, they've followed a clear process, and we can read in the memoirs of the founding fathers like Jean Monnet that they had already from the beginning in mind the creation of a super state, one state, whereby the nation state would disappear. And it's always been the declared goal. So it's clearly not some kind of secret conspiracy. Yeah. It's been the declared goal of these European institutions and their backers to have ever closer union, get rid of the nation states, which is what nobody wants. I mean, nobody wants this. We love Italy because it's Italy. It's Italian. Italians love it. We love it. Everyone loves it. France, it's the same. We want France to be French, I dare say people like certain things about Germany. Germans like Germany, and we want Germany to be German. Abolishing all these nationalities, nobody wants that. But it is the goal. That's what they've been working for. Now, most people who read that and see that, they just laugh. It's never going to happen. Well, sadly, the people out there that have this goal, they've made it public, and they've step by step worked towards it very cleverly. As Jean Monnet describes in his memoirs, we had to hide the goal. We had to work with, boring names and a long-term drawn-out process over decades. So we started with the steel union and steel agreement, transferring already sovereignty to an external body. It was essentially the precedent, and it's some boring area. And then you start to keep doing that. Now, so what's behind all that? They had this goal to have a United States of Europe, to be not like the USA, democratic with checks and balances, but from the beginning, the design was to be centralized, and totalitarian. And John actually in his great book on Europe describes, the dark roots of this quite well. But who were the people implementing these plans of centralization and undemocratic institutions? We have the names: Jean Monnet, Spaak, Schuman, all these founding fathers. Well, the documents concerning these people, I mean, who are they? What motivates them? These documents have been declassified by the CIA. So now we know they were all CIA agents, and it was a CIA plan to create a totalitarian, dictatorial, centralized superstate modeled on the Soviet Union, because the CIA always had this, envy syndrome of wanting to have as much power as the Soviet Union. Oh, these central planners have so much power, we want that. And that's why they designed the European Union the way they did. The Soviet Union claims to be a democracy with a parliament. Yes, joke, a rubber stamp parliament. All the laws were written by the Politburo. They had the real power. They were the lawmakers. That's exactly the model they introduced in Europe. The European Parliament has not proposed from scratch a single law, despite these huge salaries we pay these people. And they're the last one to point this out, of course. All the laws have been written in every detail by the European Commission, which is the head of this huge bureaucracy where, and if you look at the drafting of these laws, they've clearly been written mostly in English. So it's the City of London behind that. There's a very different logic to English written laws from continental European laws, absolutely no doubt. The Brussels BAMF, in its illogic and complexity, was written by the City of London lawyers and their lobbyists. Anyway, certainly in financial regulation, it's so apparent. So this is how things have been centralized, and it's been run by a shady organization like the CIA. They created it. It's a matter of public record. It's also been publicized. That's where we have to look. So what are the goals of secret services? They enjoy power and not being limited by the rules that limit everyone else, and then use that space to create ever greater concentrated centralized power structures, work against the many for and in favor of a tiny elite of decision makers. And we've seen that in Europe, and that seems to be the goal. Peter, does that answer your question? And for that, this crisis, crises are used to centralize control further, introduce the next level of centralized control like CBDCs. It's not going to happen without a crisis.
Well, it's something, John, that it seems to keep coming up on this podcast, because we have historians, we have experts in medicine, we have economists, and I end up always asking, is that maybe we need to study psychology to understand the motivations of these people.
How psychopaths think.
That's what Richard said a moment ago. I want to let Ewen chip in, but just before you do, Ewen, this issue of the role of the CIA in the early years of the European Union is something I've studied in some depth, and I'm particularly indebted to the work of Richard Aldrich, a British academic who unearthed a lot of stuff about the American Committee on United Europe. But so there's no doubt that what you say is true. I would only just add one thing, and that is that the policy of supporting and creating the European Union was not only covert, it was also overt, and has been overt American foreign policy. In other words, supported by the State Department, supported by successive presidents and so on. So yes, of course, there is a covert angle to it, but it's never been secret. There's absolutely nothing secret about it.
Yeah.
Dean Acheson, at the time when the Coal and Steel Community was created, the American Secretary of State overtly encouraged the continental Europeans to go ahead without, in this case, without Britain, because Britain didn't want a federal structure at that point. Anyway, Ewan, go ahead.
President Obama told the British people what to vote.
But it's been going on for decades. It's literally been going on for decades. It was under Kennedy, under Nixon, under all of them.
Yeah,
Ewan.
It's a matter of record. I mean, we can debate why they did it. Maybe as a result of desperate warfare amongst the nations of Europe that they saw imposing a model like that to be the right one.
Yeah.
But there's no question.
A good thing we haven't seen any wars in Europe since, right? Like bombing Serbia.
Yeah, well, but what is undoubtedly the case is that now, for the first time, with the possible exception of Nixon, is there a breach in the wall, because Trump does not buy that analysis. Trump instinctively supports the concept of the nation state, and he instinctively supports small nation states and personal liberty, or in an imperfect way. It's far too soon to judge whether the Trump revolution will be successful or not. If we looked at Britain in the 1980s, we might say the Thatcherite revolution had been successful, and in a way it was for about 10 or 15 years. But in today's lens, it's been swept aside. It was an aberration. It was a brief period where the UK attempted to return to some economic normality and liberty. What's happened in America, and it's got implications for Europe, if this is a change of direction, and son of Trump wins, perhaps Vance or someone else in 2028, and we start to have a more liberty-loving form of government, it might be that some of the pressures on Europe to centralize cease. And not only that, if son of Trump is to win, that implies the Trump revolution has been relatively successful economically and people feeling prosperous. The gap between America and Europe will get ever greater, and it will be ever more obvious. So I think we're at a crossroads here. It looks incredibly bleak for Europe. Our policy, those in power make desperate decision after desperate decision, either deliberately or out of poor choice. We could, in a way, it doesn't matter. The choices are extremely poor. But if we want to be optimistic, and I'm not that optimistic about the future, because there's enormous challenges, not least central bank digital currencies we've discussed, but many other challenges. Actually, if there is a philosophical breach in the States, and what's been a 50 or 60 year philosophy of containing Europe in one box, if that's blown away by a new philosophy, perhaps Europe will be forced to change direction, question mark.
Of course, one thing we can do.
I'm less optimistic than you are, but go ahead, Richard. You have the last word.
Very briefly, one thing we can do, I think, is to get leaders in Europe that work for their people. And of course, that's what increasing people realize, that there's these stooges there. And that also, in answer to an earlier question, what are they benefiting, these elites? Well, these are stooges. They work for, whether it's secret services or for, various outside forces that are clearly not aimed at the national interest, at what's good for the people in a country. Germany is the best case because here the laws are very clear. And therefore, we can't blame the Germans for the disastrous policies, because Germany, and that's the biggest problem, I think, in Europe, it has not been sovereign since May 1945. It's still under foreign occupation, and that's also legally true. There's still decisions made by the Allied occupation forces, particularly the US and the UK, that override even the German so-called constitution. I mean, it's the basic law, because since occupation, the constitution is suspended and occupied territories only get a basic law. But even that is being overwritten by the occupying powers, referring to the occupation statutes of 1945 and then other NATO privileges imposed ever since. And that's how the show's run. So in Germany, the politicians are essentially foreign stooges, supported by the CIA and other foreign secret services, who make sure that their guys are in power. And the revealed preference of their policies shows that they don't mean good for Germany. And we've seen that, of course, with the bombing of the life supply that Germany received from Russia for decades in general, but particularly in recent years, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline blown up by allies. But that makes clear it's just a vassal state, and Europe is getting the treatment that Japan received. A vassal is dispendable, and as Kissinger said, it's bad to be America's enemy, but it's fatal to be its ally. A vassal state that will be crushed and exploited, and the lifeblood sucked out when it helps the decision makers.
I must say I think I agree with you, and I find it very difficult to be optimistic vis-a-vis Trump. Trump, of course, is a very intriguing figure. We've seen Ewen, we've seen obviously Elon Musk when he was still Trump's friend as you indicated, supporting AfD and so on, and supporting these forces. He was out again, at least by video link, on the streets of London. But to me, Trump seems to be pursuing a policy of straightforward wealth extraction from, in this case now, from Europe. Wealth extraction in the forms of the 750 billion euros that Europe has to send to America to buy energy, 600 billion for armaments. The pipeline sabotage, Trump tried to stop it in 2019 and has referred to his attempt to stop it through extra territorial sanctions many times, even during his second term. He was very proud of that. And that, of course, is a straight zero-sum game in terms of energy costs. If you take out your competitors' energy supply, then you've got a very basic competitive advantage. So I'm afraid I think we've of course got a lot of self-inflicted problems, as you've shown at Ewen in your paper and as you've reminded us now. But I'm afraid I think they'll only be compounded by America, which of course is itself in decline, in relative decline, but which Trump, after all, is trying to arrest that, I think, as I say, by this process of wealth extraction. Anyway, Ewen, Stewart from London, Richard Werner from, I believe you're in Budapest, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you both, and we'd be delighted to have you back on again. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Bye-bye.